If you say it's too expensive to map it, well then, you're caught with your own argument, aren't you? You hoist on your own petard, if you know what I mean, because you can't find out all the money you're losing because you're not prepared to spend a little bit of money to find that out.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And, in each episode, I get the absolute privilege of sitting down with different people that are process practitioners or business process management professionals in a range of different organizations and in a range of different areas as well. And so today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Dr. Paul Nash. And now Paul, he is a principal consultant at Dear Watson Consulting at the moment. He's got, I think we were talking about it, Paul, before, around 20 years of business process modeling experience. And I think that's it's a really important area that we're going to dive into today, because business process management, it's quite diverse, it's quite broad, and business process modeling is a key part of that. So Paul, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So what we might do to begin with is, that was obviously a very brief introduction of who you are and what you've done. I actually didn't even mention that you've worked at a number of large Australian organisations, including Telstra, Toll Group, ATO, and Australian Unity, which I think it's important for our audience to understand that. But maybe take us back to the early days of where you were first introduced to this idea of business process modelling, and then take us on a journey leading up to where we are today.
Yeah, well, it goes back really to the days when I was the principal trainer at Object Training, or Object Consulting, if you like,
right?
The training arm of Object Consulting. Essentially, that organisation used to train people in business process modelling, and essentially use flowcharts in those earlier days to represent business flows, if you like. Now, two things happened in the early 2000s, in around about 2005. Activity diagrams went through a complete overhaul in the unified modelling language, in UML.
Right.
They added a huge range of diagrammatic features that allowed them to much more faithfully represent a business process. And then not long after that, business process modelling notation was essentially the aim of making business process diagrams understandable to the business audience.
Right.
Now, it became, if you like, those two competing standards were around, but what we at Object Consulting and Object Training did is we converted all our courses to use business process modeling notation, because we saw that had the potential. It was event-based. It had a wide range of diagrammatic symbols, and it was based on research that went into what are all the patterns that happen in a business process, and found that all the other ways of representing a business process, including activity diagrams, didn't have a rich enough diagrammatic symbol set to represent those. And so business process modeling notation sort of really took off because of that. And we weren't the only one. So I guess my role for the couple of years following that was to write courses in business process modeling notation, introduce it to people around Australia. So I used to travel around Australia, training groups all over Australia in how to represent their process using business process modeling notation. And of course, it went through its own evolution from BPMN 1 to BPMN 1.1, 1.2, and then BPMN 2, which is the current version. And they are considerably different to one another. But the main thing is that, if you like, the key factor that makes BPMN 2 so useful, and I don't know that it's fully understood by everyone that uses it, by the way, is first of all, not only does it show who's doing what and when in the process, it shows the entities, people, and roles that process interfaces with. So it has a way of showing the interface between the process and external entities like external participants and systems. So that you're not only seeing what's happening in the process, you're seeing what information is coming into the process, where it's coming from, and what information is leaving the process and where it's going to.
Yes.
Now, that's the kind of thing that work instructions that a process participant, they don't need that information typically.
Right.
They just need to do the bits in the process, follow the instructions. If you like, a flowchart's fine for them. But the problem with using a flowchart to understand the process are many and varied. So if you don't know where the information is going to, where it's coming from, how often, and so on, then you're in a complete disadvantage to understand the process. So really, BPMN is a revolution for the managerial or the people who want to manage their processes well. It's not so much a revolution for those that are doing the task, because they still prefer to have work instructions that say, step 1, do this, step 2, do that, step 3, something or other, and go to step 7, So they still prefer and still use work instructions.
Yes.
So BPMN is not a revolution for them. And indeed, most people who are performing tasks in processes don't really want to see the BPMN version, because you have to be trained to understand it. It doesn't really help them. But the people that it really helps is anyone who wants to understand and improve the process.
Yes.
So you can have a process without BPMN, but you can't easily understand it and improve it. So that's essentially my main, if you like, role, is to show people how that's possible. And as with all these standards, these international standards, they're all things to all people. BPMN has hundreds of symbols, and you really only need 20 or 30 to represent processes well. But which 20 or 30,
Yes.
And when would you use them, and how would you use them, and why wouldn't you use the other ones? That's pretty important. If you let people loose on BPMN, they can, depending on their creativity, they can create, a horrible quagmire of symbols because they don't quite realize that in the end they've got to communicate something to somebody. It's no use just using every possible symbol and thinking that you're a great process modeler. You've got to use the symbols that help you communicate your process. And if you fail in that, well, the notation is useless, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I think that's a really important point, it's got to be understood by someone. You can't, if you're trying to make something complex, it may fail to sort of really add that value. But, there are many different opinions out there about, I guess, standards and notations and what should be done and what shouldn't be done. But what, in your experience, when, I guess, coming into an organization to do that training, what are some of the biggest challenges an organization face? And you did mention one just then, but an organization will face when trying to put together or define and use a modeling standard or notation.
Okay, well, there's a few challenges. The first challenge is to understand the difference between having a writing knowledge of the notation and a reading knowledge of the notation. So only a few people need to be able to produce process models in let's say BPMN2, but a much wider range of people need to be able to read them. Now, it is quite readable. It's interesting. I've had quite a bit of experience of just showing BPMN diagrams to people who've never been trained in BPMN. If they're well done, they're actually, most people intuitively understand a flowchart-like language, and there should be enough text on the diagram to actually describe what's happening. Now, they can't produce it because they're not sure what the symbols may mean. But the benefit of having a reading knowledge is that if you take the diagram and, if you like, you look at it at a distance, you can still see the main aspects of the process without reading any text. So that's one of the main things that BPMN brought. It has a lot of symbols to represent events, waiting and doing this and doing something at a particular time. It has ways of showing these things with symbols so that you can show loops in a particular way. It has its own way of showing loops, not just an arrow going backwards, which is the old flowchart way. So It has many different things that mean that if you use it properly, you can understand the structure of a process by looking at it at a distance. And, you know, a diagram's worth 1,000 words, if you like.
Right.
But it doesn't replace words. It just is worth 1,000 of them. You know, you need another 200 or 300 to represent what each symbol is, to say what each symbol is doing. So that's the first thing, reading. So for instance, at Object Consult, when we were training people, we'd have a 2-day course for those that want to produce process models, which is like a minimum. It probably needs 4 days, but anyway. And face-to-face training is very much out of vogue these days, in a way, unfortunately, because it's actually quite hard to learn how to do this without doing it face-to-face and, you know, leaning over somebody's shoulder and saying, well, have you tried this and what about that, and so on. And,
Right.
But the reading knowledge, half a day is enough to show people examples and so on. So that's the first thing. The next challenge is BPMN, the standard. It's hundreds of pages of specification, right?
Right.
Now, if you let somebody loose on that, good luck, you know, because you need to be an expert data modeler to start with, because it's model and notation. It has a model using UML class diagrams, actually.
Right.
And so it's a complex document to understand, and it only has a few fragments of samples of what you can that you would think of as the diagrammatic notation.
Right. Okay.
So it has to be translated. So each one of the first things I do is go around Australia and help organisations write their BPMN or their modelling guidelines. Which symbols are you going to use? Which ones aren't you going to use? And what are examples of the symbols used well? And what are the examples of symbols used poorly?
Right.
How many levels in your diagram? How are you going to do your leveling from the name of a process or a process group down to the lowest level? And where are you going to stop?
Yes.
You know? So we used to have this stopping condition that, you know, you stop modeling a process when you fully understand it. So, you know, it's sort of, now that also includes, by the way, an interface to work instructions. So written documents that people have on their desk, on their process in their process Bible, or however they operate. So they go to a page and say, today I'm answering a phone call and this is what I've got to do. You know, they typically aren't going to be in the diagrams. The diagram's going to show what all the different consultants are doing in the call center or whatever it is, what types of processes there are, and allow you to analyze the throughput and all the different bottlenecks and so on. That's the intention of the diagrammatic level.
Yes.
And then up at the hierarchy level is, well, which processes in which departments do we have? You know.
Yes. Right.
So if you like, there's many levels of you know, of abstraction in a process model, and you know, all the environments like big cloud and blah blah blah, all the different environments, they all have a way of addressing those different levels of abstraction. So they make life easy for you when you adopt an environment. But you know, you can still have all those levels of abstraction. You just make life harder for yourself if you don't have an environment to put them all in.
Yes, yes.
So they're the two things mainly. You've got to have your own guidelines, because you've got to, because different organizations are quite different. You know,
absolutely.
Some, you know, like in a call center, it might be very different to the procedures in a laboratory.
Yes.
Or the procedures, you know, for instance, you know, I've trained people inside government departments. Their procedures are again quite different, and you know, or there might be research and development procedures that technical people use. That there's a wide variety. Business is very varied, you know, as you can imagine, and exactly how you would represent a process in a particular business context needs to be adapted. By the way, the other big revolution when BPMN was invented is all the big players like IBM and Oracle, they all built stacks on with BPMN at the top. So you know, you can go off to Oracle and you can buy a stack where you create your business processes in BPMN, you add a bit of data and a few screens, and the whole thing is changeable by the promise is that it's all changeable by the business. They can add a new screen or a new task to the process, redeploy that process, and the whole thing gets built. And then underneath the BPMN layer is what's called the business process executable layer, BPEL, which is an executable layer that makes things happen, if you like. So all of a sudden you had the whole promise of automation being led by a diagrammatic standard up at the business level. And that's why the notation is more complex than you'd think it should be for a business, because it has to be executable. It's like a language, a visual language, actually.
Right.
Now, not many people get to grips with that layer, because they either buy an environment that one of the big consulting firms, Oracle or IBM built for them. They're not likely to, try and interface a BPEL layer themselves. That would be probably a bit of a silly thing to do, but it has the ability to do all of that.
Yes. Yeah.
One of its benefits. So it's used by, and by the way, the standard is being driven by those big players.
That's great. And for someone listening right now, that's hearing you talk about BPMN and different modeling notations and standards, and maybe they're within an organization where they don't have a set standard or notation, and it's not something that that maybe there isn't an appetite there for it because they don't see the value. Now, obviously, when an organization brings you in, I'm assuming they understand the value, but they want to know, they're saying we want to do it correctly. Paul, can you come in and help us? What are some of the biggest wins that you've seen when an organization adopts a notation for modeling? Yeah.
Well, I think the big, usually they call someone like myself in when a wheel has dropped off, the scenarios are the process is wildly inefficient.
Right.
Maybe there are different versions of the process in different regions. That's a common scenario. A lack of process, sort of alignment, if you like.
Yes.
Or they're merged with another company and they have to merge two sets of processes, one well documented, the other one not, or whatever it might be.
Right.
Or they need to change the process. New technology. And another thing driving that is robotics, any kind of automation they might want to introduce. So they've got an as-is process that's all manual or very manual using systems, but they want to replace certain tasks with automated robotics, software robots and so on. That's quite common as well. So whenever you want to improve or change the process, then you've got to start by representing the current process so you know the beast you're dealing with. And then you've got to work with various techniques to work out which bits are automatable. There's all sorts of other techniques you need to understand, well, where are all your pain points? What are the things, where are your bottlenecks? And, Lean, Six Sigma approaches are all very good at all of that. But in general, off the shelf, if you bring in a Lean Six Sigma team, they're not so good at representing the process, actually. They don't, if you look at the Six Sigma kind of approach, it's still couched in terms of flowcharts and value chain, like various things that were tools that pre-exist, if you like, BPMN. So sometimes I work with Six Sigma teams and I such that I give them the benefit of representing the processes properly, and then they add the benefit of being able to now analyze the pain points and all the various other things that Six Sigma is good at.
That's great. That's good. And talking about, getting buy-in to, a particular notation, a modeling notation, is that difficult to get that buy-in, obviously to do the effort, to do the work, to invest the time, effort and energy and money to I guess define a standard that everyone's going to be following, because I guess that's the question that the leadership team is going to be asking is, well, what's the return on this? We've been documenting our processes without doing this, without following a specific notation. What's the return going to be?
Well, I think the easiest way to answer that is to say, do a pilot, take a process that you think might have some problems and see what comes out of that pilot. Because by looking at the process, by modeling it properly, and by determining what is actually wrong with it as opposed to what people think is wrong with it, in other words, actually verifying what it is that may be a problem, and to some extent quantifying that. So, doing simulations, even if you haven't bought an environment yet, you're doing some kind of simulations on what could be the case if we did, what if analysis, or what if we change this, what if we change that role to that. Often people don't understand what's wrong with the process until they see it properly. And as soon as they see it, they say, well, that looks silly. Like, for instance, I was doing some process modeling for an organization, and I mapped the process, and they were, partially engaged, if you like, while I did that. And they're thinking, well, Paul's costing a lot, but anyway, and then I showed them the process, and they looked at it, and, I made a few observations just from looking at the as-is process. And of course, they immediately realized things that they hadn't thought about.
Right.
In that particular case, it was the escalation levels were all wrong. That they were escalating way too frequently, and they hadn't quite realized that till they saw the diagram showing the process, then an escalation to a middle manager, an escalation to a senior, and an escalation to the CEO. And they said, well, hold it. No wonder we can't get anything done, because is that real? Are they really the business rules?
Right.
So they realized that the process was broken, but they hadn't. The easiest way to show them was to just show them the diagram, say, well, look, it's clearly broken. The easiest way to fix is do this, 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 and this, and bingo, an immediate win. Okay. Now then you've got. Then, of course, they're on side and they say, all right, okay, so this is useful. It can deliver things quite quickly, actually. And you don't have to get a black belt in Six Sigma, even though I cost more than one. But anyway, you don't have to get a whole Six Sigma team in, and they whir away for 6 months, and then they give you this densely worded report to say how you can fix things, and you say, oh my God, that's going to cost a fortune, and you shelve it. You can actually get very quick wins by just mapping, if you like, your worst processes and looking at them. And then your own middle managers will probably be able to tell you what they need to do. So it empowers actually the middle management who didn't really realize that they knew enough to improve the processes. And you don't have to have a special group that does process improvement. You just have to have a way of showing the processes effectively and getting your middle managers who are very close to the processes and the team leads and so on, who know the process actually, but haven't quite fully grasped, all the implications of what they're doing and the downstream effects and the upstream effect. They haven't realized all of that. And as soon as they see it, they're actually able to solve those problems relatively, or you can get some very quick big wins actually. So in my experience, a short exercise in just modeling the process, the upstream and the downstream and how they interact and the quick pain points from the team that's experiencing them can deliver you very quick wins actually. And that's, I guess, what I do day to day. I just go into organizations, spend a short amount of time adding my expertise to their expertise, and all of a sudden you can get quick wins pretty quickly. And of course, then once, if you've convinced them of that, then they can look around at environments to actually put all this in, because if they want to move up the maturity, it's all very well to do that ad hoc with their worst process. That's all, and maybe they'll save some money that way and all that kind of thing. But to actually move up the maturity chain level, move from maturity level 0 or 1 to 2 or whatever, they really need to have a defined process of process modeling. Where do they put their processes? How often do they review them? How complete are they? And all that kind of thing that really is part of keeping your processes aligned with your business strategy, which is actually the whole aim. You have to have business processes that are aligned to your business strategy. Now that business strategy can change and the processes can remain the same. So you've also got to have this next level up actually. And I guess the other thing that I'm keen, another diagrammatic standard, by the way, I'm keen to wax lyrical about is Archimate 3, which really is a diagrammatic standard that comes with the Open Group's architectural framework, TOGAF, and in the business process modeling space allows you to show what processes do you have and how do they align to your strategy. Now, that's an incredibly important thing to do periodically, because otherwise you're stuck with processes and you've lost the reason why they're there. And the business thinks it's moved on, but it's, in bigger organizations, like Telstra or whatever, any big organization, this is always happening, because the organization wants to move at this speed, but the processes move at a much slower speed, because you've got to map them, write work instructions, train people, train offshore people, launch the process, you know what I mean? And by the time you've done that, the business has moved on. So alignment to your business strategy is very important. It's less likely to be a problem in a small organization. The bigger it gets, the more layers of managers there are between the people who think they know what the company's doing and the people who are doing what the company told them to do, and
Yes.
the more layers there are, the more wheels that can drop off, if you like.
That's great. A lot of huge points there. And I was just taking a couple of notes then, but there's one thing you mentioned just before about process transparency, being able to show management what is happening in the process. And when there's that process transparency and they can clearly see what's actually going on, then what you were saying was that they often can identify the pain points and the problems, and then they can come up with solutions of how can we improve this process? How can we make that better? But that came about because of clear, documented processes that were easily consumed, easily understood.
Well, just as another example, I did the processes, many processes for Army headquarters in Canberra. And that meant traveling around Australia to different groups, hobnobbing with brigadiers and lieutenant colonels and blah, blah, blah. And actually the CFO of Army and so on, who holds the purse strings. It's a good person to know if you want to be paid. Anyway, so, and showing them diagrams of their processes. And of course, they're typically, I don't know if you've had much to do with Army, but brigadiers are very, very bright people. They're sort of selected in this sort of funnel that gradually, as you go up the funnel, they tend in general to be extremely competent. They're only chosen out of a smallish number of people, but they rise by their own abilities, really. And the fact that they can look at these diagrams fairly quickly and understand what's going on was quite surprising to me. I hadn't realized. And so I remember presenting at one point to the head of land operations, who actually was a pretty amazing guy, who was about 6'8" tall, and he had this huge scar across his face. I could imagine it happened in action somewhere. And I was describing the process, and he pointed down to the bottom. He said, "Oh, is that me down the bottom there? Am I doing that?" And so he could read the diagram and work out that was an exception that happened, and he'd never been trained in it, but, people can actually understand the process much more easily than they think by looking at a diagram.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was an interesting case.
That's great. And the other point you mentioned just before was how key or how important it is for process to link to the overall strategy. And if there isn't that link, then
Well, that's absolutely vital, isn't it? Now, BPMN itself doesn't have any mechanism for that. So, BPMN is great as a diagrammatic standard for showing who's doing what, where, with what, and and where's the information coming from, and so on. But is that the right process? What's its value? How does it link to your goals and objectives? That's all another diagrammatic standard called Archimate 3. So there's the motivational level and the business level. And in Archimate 3, diagrams that show that are very important for the more senior of the managers, the ones that are responsible for defining, well, which groups should there be? What capabilities should we have? Where should they reside? Then that's the diagrammatic standard that's really great at exposing what all those things should be. Now, once you believe you know what your capabilities are, what teams you need, and what processes you need, if you like, then BPMN, if you like, part of the training I used to do was train people in Archimate 3 for that upper level analysis. And that's, by the way, built on a standard called the BMM, the Business Motivation Model, by the OMG group, that upper level. And then BPMN kicks in at the level where you want to know, well, what the hell is happening in that what's happening in that process? So a seamless integration between those two is the most desirable way to go, to implement both those diagrammatic standards, and so that you have links between them. And there's many other refinements. Like the other thing that I'm pretty keen about in process is to really understand a process, you have to understand the information that's flowing through the process. It's no use just knowing who does what. You've got to know, what are they doing it to? How does it change its state as it goes through? How does it, what's the structure of the information associated with an invoice or a purchase order or this or that? What you've got to know you've got to have that somewhere. And generally speaking, it sits in a data team somewhere. And there's the beginning of your next problem, the process team talking to the data team. It's like oil and there's water, well, luck on that one. Anyway, that's the subject of maybe another discussion on process intelligence, mixing oil and water, process and data. And that's another thing that I'm pretty passionate about these days. So a lot of what I do is in that area. So that's a whole other ball game, by the way.
Right. And when an organization is trying to adopt, say, BPMN 2.0 or a modeling standard, what are some of the objections that might arise as to, why we shouldn't do BPMN?
Okay, well, one of the main one is we tried modeling, it took ages and we didn't get any benefits from it. So mostly people think it takes a long time. Okay. And they don't get any benefit, and they've survived perfectly well without it. Now, to answer those, you just have, the thing is, it does take time. Whether it's a long time, that depends on the skill set of the people you've got, but it does take time. So, maybe for each diagram, you need half a day, and for a process, you might need 4 or 5 days, and there are 20 processes, there's 80 days. It starts to mount up, The thing is, that's a known cost. You can work that out, and you can really, you can just focus that on your most high profile processes if you want to minimize that cost. Right. The costs of not doing it are pretty immense, because what you'll find if you do it properly is you'll find savings. I've never been in an organization that hasn't found savings, many multiples of the cost of doing that. So the trouble is, they're funded to do it, and they don't have the extra money to do the extra process modeling, but all the costs associated with poor processes are borne by the whole organization and are not visible. And so it takes a managerial layer of some maturity to realize that they're going to reduce the costs of the organization. And obviously, you can quantify that so that, you can actually do a return on investment kind of analysis, look at exactly, well, what kind of savings and when and so on. But even when you do that, still people are sometimes reluctant to do the mapping. But the mapping is vital in my experience, because if you don't do that, you're destined to repeat the problems that you used to have, which is people doing a whole lot of stuff potentially inefficiently, with duplications and bottlenecks that are causing you unknown costs, and you have no way of knowing those until you map things. So the only way you know how inefficient a process is to map it. If you say it's too expensive to map it, well then, you're caught with your own argument, aren't you? You're hoist on your own petard, if you know what I mean, because you can't find out all the money you're losing because you're not prepared to spend a little bit of money to find that out. I just usually wax lyrical and to the intermediate and senior managerial layer, and eventually they agree with me, once they let me speak for long enough. But but it is important. I mean, almost any organization can do a lot better. In Australia, we must have some of the worst managed sets of processes, around, quite frankly. Right.
Right.
Part of that is we're not used to standards as such. In Europe, they're much more used to standards. In America, for instance, you can't get federal funding as a department, and unless you have a full architectural model of, so that architectural models are used universally in America and not used a lot in Australia because they're optional.
Right.
And
Yes.
architects, I mean, ivory tower, they cost a lot, and and they're not mandated. So we've got a whole lot of government departments that don't have proper architectures for everything, and that goes for their process architecture, if you like, as well. And so we're not used to that, and so it is a bit of an uphill battle. But when people do adopt it, they do. But probably it takes them about 6 months, and then it becomes a vital part of what they do. They can't easily go back, if you know what I mean. So, it's a matter of taking people from where they are to where they want to be.
Right.
And illustrating how they can get there. All organizations want to be there. We want to make more money. We want to be more efficient, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, fine. But how do we go from where we are, which is not good? How do we get there? That's the challenge. And a big part of it is process modeling and, its bigger cousin, process management. So, yeah, it's a very interesting area and has kept me busy for the last 20 years,
That's good. And you mentioned earlier that, standards and notations have been evolving and changing over time, BPMN 1, 1.1, 1.2, up to now BPMN 2.0. If we look into the future or the next 5-10 years of modeling standards and notations, do you have any thoughts around that? Whether it's like where what direction you think we're heading in, or is there's something that you're like, these changes should happen because these are the current weaknesses of what's happening right now? Yeah,
there's a couple of things. I think integration between the standards. See, Archimate is a European kind of standard, whereas BPMN is more an American standard,
right.
Group. There are these competing areas. I think they need to integrate more. In other words, it's not good enough just to map the process. You've also got to have represent the value of the processes and their connection to the whole strategy and objectives level of an organization. So that's one thing. The second thing is, interestingly, activity diagrams in UML have one particular feature that isn't in BPMN. It's one feature I miss. It's being able to represent, mostly in a process, you're representing an instance version of the process. Like something, you're saying, well, an order comes in, then we do this to it, then we do that to it, blah, 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 and it goes to this team and then back to that team. So you're following an instance through the process and you stamp that process out with multiple instances. So it's based on that kind of approach, which is good for understanding what happens as they go through. In UML activity diagrams, you have what are called expansion regions, and they have you have the ability to, if you like, look down at the factory that's carrying out the process. So things come in here, they go over there, then they're streamed off to there, and then they go over to there, and then they're divided between these. Then they go out the roller doors at the back, so supplies come in this end. And so you're looking down. That manufacturing view of a process is actually a very valuable. So if I'm really doing processes well and someone wants the full enchilada, you need Archimate 3 for the top. You need a manufacturing view. You say, well, there's 4 teams. They're all, stuff comes in here. If you want to look at the throughput properly, then you need UML activity diagrams, actually. And you don't need too many of them, but where there are these factory-like processes, the loans approval, there's our team. We've got 4 teams in different states, and each of those, if you like, is an expansion region. They all have their queues of stuff coming in and going out, and it's a bit like a simulation, if you like. So being able to look at different types of view of a process, I think, is the next main thing. Now, I think we've spent quite a few years, the last 4 or 5 years integrating process and data. So process intelligence. How do you get data in? How do you map it onto a process? All those kinds of things that are really process mining and process intelligence, which is really the cutting edge now. But I think there's other ways of looking at processes to get that full integrated view and an environment with all of those in it. You know, and you know, another underdone bit is the state machines associated with things going through the process. So, you know, to really get a tight view of the process, you need a number of views of the process, and I think we're only just starting to realize that.
That's great. That's really good insight. Thanks for sharing that. And then the last one I wanted to touch on is, you know, that there would be people that would be listening to this right now that, you know, maybe they're learning about modeling notations for the first time. Maybe they've heard of BPMN 2.0, but that doesn't mean much to them apart from what we've talked about today. For someone that wants to learn more, whether it's, you know, a process specialist or a business analyst or someone going through university, or whether it's someone from the senior leadership team or that executive level, where would you encourage them if, you know, if you've whet their appetite, so to speak, and they want to learn more about modeling notations and standards and the value in that and what that can bring to their organization? What now? What are the next steps they should take? Where can they learn more?
Well, they probably should look out for my upcoming BPMN masterclass. But look, it's a little bit hard won. A lot of the training organizations, particularly the one that I was a member of, don't exist anymore. People look for online training. They might go to YouTube, and generally the quality of stuff is poor, quite frankly. It's usually done by people that don't have a view, a holistic view of process modeling, and it's not easy to gain that experience. Generally speaking, so we've sort of gone backwards in that respect, actually. But the easiest way is to actually go and get an environment and then get trained by the people that that is actually the quickest and easiest way now, because associated with choosing one of those environments, which you can pay for by the month, if you know what I mean. So they're not like the old days where you buy an expensive thing that you install on your own in-house server, and you know, it costs you a fortune to buy the thing, and then eventually everyone forgets it's there. You can actually pay by the month, and the teams associated with those products have all of the necessary you know, like personnel to show you how to use their products and how to use them effectively. And there's so many aspects to that: mapping it, doing simulations, what if analysis, you know, maybe data process intelligence, all the things you might want to do. You can be trained in all those. It helps if you choose an environment, because if you just try to get trained generally, only a part of that training will be useful to you, because it has to be adapted to whatever environment you choose. So I just encourage people to have a look at the environments around, and there are the higher profile ones that we're all aware of. You know, and go through a process of, and indeed I recently went through a process of writing a set of requirements for a company to choose an environment. And you know, that's the way, in a sense, to go. Make sure that that environment matches what your needs are. Just start there and start mapping your processes, and then evaluate every 6 months to see how you're going. And in the early stages, you don't have to invest a lot. You just have to take your worst processes and try and improve those. And then once you've done all that, of course, you might want to expand your investment in it, because you can then work on the processes that are going to give you less of a return, but a return. And you know, you can make your way through your process environment and improve it as you go. So I think by and large, it's best to try and choose an environment before you do the training. But you know, I will be launching a general BPMN training course that the people can look out for me on in LinkedIn. I think the difficulty is that the environments, each one of them have their own peculiarity. They each implement a subset of BPMN actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've sort of got to know how to use that subset because somebody's already made that choice for you.
Right.
And then you can make further choices to reduce that subset, but you can't increase it. You can't, if they haven't implemented certain things, you can't add it easily, unless you join the users group and get them to, But anyway, so that'd be my principal advice, really.
Yeah, and that's great advice because I think, theory is good on one hand, but putting something into practice and learning from your mistakes, that's going to provide huge value there. Yeah. But Paul, obviously, like well, I think we've been able to stretch it to 45 minutes today, but obviously in 45 minutes, we can only scrape the surface really in what there is to know. But I know that the audience is going to glean a lot from this conversation, particularly around, modeling standards and notations and the reason why. I think that's a big question, important question to ask is why. So I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and sitting down with me and sharing your wisdom.
No problem. My pleasure.